This morning's scripture comes from Exodus chapters 2 and 3. It's a little long, so you're welcome to follow along in your bulletins as the text is printed there. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" Then Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God.
It often gets said that failure is the great preparer of greatness. And when we look back over history in regards to those who have been successful, we see this to be true. Bill Gates, in the world of business, flunked out of Harvard in the 1970s. Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, tried 9,000 times in regards to that invention before finally actually succeeding. In the world of sports, Michael Jordan got cut from the varsity basketball team. In the world of music, Beethoven, the composer, his first music teacher said that he was hopeless in the world of composing. In the world of entertainment, there was Walt Disney. At the first press conference after Disney World was opened up, he was ridiculed by a reporter because he didn't have enough good ideas. In the world of books, there was John Grisham, who tried to get his first legal thriller published 11 times, and it was only thereafter that it finally worked. And then in the world of politics, there was Abraham Lincoln, lost 12 different races before becoming president. And in the world of the Hebrew Bible, there was Moses, who endured a season of failure in his life before God ever called him to greatness. For the choir was right this morning. Moses was not perfect. You see, oftentimes when you and I consider the story of Moses, we go back to that story of Moses being a baby in the basket in the Nile River, the story that I spoke about just last Sunday. And then the next thing we think about in Moses' life is God appearing to Moses in the burning bush. But there is a story sandwiched in between the two that I think is particularly relevant to Moses' call. One scholar joked about it this way. She simply wrote, "In between the story of baby in a basket and burning bush, there was the big blunder." For you'll recall in Exodus chapter 2, Moses took the life of the Egyptian taskmaster. We're told that once upon a time, Moses was watching as God's people were being mistreated by an Egyptian taskmaster, and Moses kind of pulled a look here and a look there, saw what was happening, and decided to take this man's life and then buried the body in the sand as though he wanted to, cover it up. Well, it didn't take long for the secret to get out, and Moses' failure began to have a huge impact. Not only was that murder very, very difficult for generations of people to come, but it was also very hard on God's people, as now Pharaoh was even more mad at God's people, so much so that Moses was sort of displaced, if you will. He had to flee Egypt all the way to Midian. And it was there in Midian that God appeared to Moses in and through the burning bush. Moses, Moses, here I am. I want to ask a question of you all this Labor Day weekend, and it's perhaps an appropriate one to reflect upon. What if there was something about Moses' failure in Exodus chapter 2 that was connected to God's call of Moses to greatness? What if the two stories are connected? As one scholar pointed out, if Moses had been successful shortly prior to God's call, would Moses' burning ego have allowed him to hear from the burning bush? What if God, in moments of failure in Moses' life and in our lives, is not absent? What if that season of failure is a ripe opportunity for God to call us forth? For when we fail in our everyday lives, when we make mistakes, we often make believe that it's the end of the road. But in the life of Moses, it's not the end of any road. There's a new road that comes. There's a turn. There's something more. God does something that's next. I want you to consider just for a moment in your life where recently you may have made a mistake. Perhaps it was an investment that went wrong, or an idea that didn't go right, or perhaps it was a decision or a choice that didn't work out, or a moral failure, or something that just happened and it wasn't supposed to happen as you had planned it, but it just happened that way, and you felt as though it was a failure. Does that mean that it's at the end of the road? Or maybe, just maybe, is that failure fueling the fire? For I would argue quite strongly that you cannot detach the story of God calling Moses in the burning bush apart from the failure, because it was in that season of life, in that ripe territory where Moses had been humbled, that God spoke to Moses. Moses, Moses, here I am. It is Labor Day weekend, and one of the stories in the world of business that we've been following has been the story of artificial intelligence. And I was reading an article this past week about IBM, and in reading that article, I was reminded of one of my favorite IBM stories. And if you've been in business over the course of your lifetime, this is one that has been exchanged on numerous occasions. It's the story of Tom Watson Sr., the founder and 40-year leader of IBM, running his company one day. And there was a junior executive at IBM who went off on a very risky business venture and decided to make a $10 million investment in something, and it totally bombed. Well, Watson decided to call the young man into his office, and he asked his assistant to bring the young man in. And the young man was very, very humbled in the moment, and he had typed out his letter and had boxed up the possessions in his office. And he walked into Tom Watson's suite there at the IBM headquarters, and he said, "Here it is. I resign. I give up. No worries." And Tom Watson replied back to him, "Your resignation? I just spent $10 million educating you. I can't afford your resignation. What if after seasons of failure in our lives, God is not absent, but there's something more, something next? For part of what the story of the burning bush following the blender teaches me is that our God of grace can afford that we are human and make mistakes. Our God of grace can afford us patience as we seek to persevere through all of that which is failed. But what our God cannot afford is a resignation.